"This is the story of Please Pretend You're My Dad," little girl said. What the billionaire Sheikh did next shocked everyone as it truly unfolded. The rain hammered against the windows of the Children's Hospital in Seattle, each drop carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken prayers.
Inside room 314, 8-year-old Emma Martinez sat cross-legged on her hospital bed, her small fingers wrapped around a worn teddy bear that had seen better days. The chemotherapy had taken her hair months ago, but it hadn't touched the fierce light in her brown eyes or the way she smiled when the nurses brought her coloring books. She had been waiting for 3 hours for her father to show up for visiting hours, checking the clock on the wall every few minutes, her hope dimming with each passing moment like a candle running out of wick. If you're already feeling the weight of this moment, take a second to like the video and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because these stories about the connections we make in our darkest hours carry more meaning when we know who's listening. The man who would change everything walked past her room by accident. Khalil al-Rashid had come to the hospital to visit the new pediatric wing his foundation had funded. A quiet tour with the hospital administrators who wanted to show him how his $30 million donation was being used. He wore a simple navy suit, his graying beard neatly trimmed, his eyes carrying the kind of weariness that comes from carrying too much responsibility for too long. At 52, Khalil had built a technology empire that spanned 3 continents, but he had never learned how to build a bridge to his own son, who lived in Dubai with his ex-wife and barely spoke to him anymore. As the hospital director droned on about patient capacity and treatment protocols, Khalil's attention drifted to the small voice coming from room 314. Emma was talking to herself, or perhaps to her teddy bear, creating an elaborate fantasy about a tea party where her father would finally show up and they would eat imaginary cake and talk about her drawings. The innocence in her voice cut through the sterile hospital air like a blade, and Khalil found himself slowing his pace, then stopping altogether. The hospital director noticed his distraction and followed his gaze toward Emma's room. "Ah, that's Emma Martinez," he said with the practiced sympathy of someone who had delivered too much bad news. "Stage 3 leukemia. She's been here for 4 months. Her father, well, some people can't handle this kind of situation. He visits less and less frequently." Khalil felt something twist in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. He thought about his own son, Amir, and the countless soccer games he had missed, the bedtime stories he had delegated to nannies, the phone calls that had grown shorter and more formal over the years. Success had cost him everything that mattered, and now he stood in a hospital hallway, watching a little girl wait for a father who might never come. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward Emma's room. The director looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, Mr. al-Rashid. I'm sure she would appreciate the company." Khalil knocked gently on the doorframe, and Emma looked up from her coloring book. Her face brightened with the kind of hope that children reserve for strangers who might bring good news. "Hi," she said simply. "Are you a doctor?" "No," Khalil replied, stepping into the room. "I'm just visiting. My name is Khalil. What's your name?" "Emma. Emma Martinez. I'm 8 years old, but I'll be 9 next month if—" She trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like smoke. Khalil sat down in the chair beside her bed, the same chair where her father should have been sitting. "What are you coloring?" Emma held up her book, showing him a picture of a family at a picnic. She had colored the father figure with dark hair and kind eyes, and Khalil realized with a start that the man in the drawing looked remarkably like him. "That's my dad," Emma said proudly. "He's really busy with work, but he's coming to see me today. He promised." The lie was so fragile, so desperate, that Khalil felt his heart break a little. He had heard that same tone in his own son's voice years ago, when Amir would ask when Daddy was coming home from his business trip, when they could go to the park, when they could just spend time together without phones or meetings, or the constant pressure of building an empire. They talked for an hour. Emma told him about her favorite books, about the nurses who brought her extra pudding, about the dream she had of becoming a veterinarian when she grew up. Khalil found himself sharing stories about his childhood in Jordan, about the goats his grandfather had raised, about the way the desert looked at sunset when the sand turned gold and purple. He hadn't thought about those memories in years, hadn't realized how much he missed the simplicity of that life before money and power had complicated everything. When visiting hours ended, Khalil stood to leave, but Emma's small hand caught his sleeve. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked, and the hope in her voice was so pure it made his chest ache. "I'll try," he said, knowing he would move mountains to keep that promise. That night, Khalil sat in his penthouse apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, staring at his phone. He had Amir's number memorized, had dialed it 100 times without pressing call. The time difference meant it was morning in Dubai, and his son would be getting ready for school. Khalil imagined him eating breakfast, maybe thinking about his father, maybe not thinking about him at all. He called anyway. Baba? Amir's voice was surprised, cautious. They hadn't spoken in 3 weeks. Habibi, Khalil said, using the Arabic endearment he hadn't used in months. And I wanted to hear your voice. They talked for 20 minutes, the longest conversation they had had in years. Amir told him about school, about his friends, about the soccer team he had joined. Khalil listened, really listened, without checking his email or thinking about the board meeting scheduled for the next morning. When he hung up, Khalil made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life. He cleared his schedule for the next day. Emma was waiting for him when he arrived at the hospital the following afternoon. She had saved him a seat at her imaginary tea party, complete with plastic cups and a plate of cookies the nurses had brought her. My dad couldn't make it today, she said matter-of-factly, but Khalil could see the disappointment she was trying to hide. He had to work. Well, Khalil said, settling into the chair beside her bed. I'm here. Would that be okay? Emma considered this seriously, her 8-year-old mind working through the implications. Would you pretend to be my dad? Just for today? The question hit Khalil like a physical blow. Here was this brave little girl, fighting for her life, asking him to fill the void left by a father who couldn't handle the weight of her illness. And here was Khalil, a man who had failed his own son, being offered a chance at redemption he didn't deserve. I would be honored, he said quietly. What happened next would become the most important hour of Khalil's life. Emma showed him her drawings, her collection of get-well cards from her classmates, the journal where she wrote letters to her mother who had died 2 years earlier. She talked about her fears, about the treatments that made her sick, about the dreams she had where she was healthy and running through fields of flowers. Khalil listened with the attention he had never given his own son, and in return, he shared parts of himself he had kept locked away for years. He told her about the loneliness of success, about the weight of responsibility, about the way money could buy everything except the things that mattered most. Do you miss your little boy? Emma asked with the directness that only children possess. Every day, Khalil admitted, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. And you should call him more, Emma said sagely. Kids like it when their dads call, even if they pretend they don't. Over the following weeks, Khalil's visits became the highlight of Emma's days and the anchor of his own life. He would arrive each afternoon with books, art supplies, and stories from the outside world. Emma would share her latest drawings, her thoughts about the other children in the ward, her plans for when she got better. But Emma wasn't getting better. The doctors delivered the news on a rainy Thursday in November, their voices gentle but firm. The latest round of chemotherapy hadn't worked. They could try experimental treatments, but the chances were slim, and the quality of life would be poor. Emma had weeks, maybe a month. Khalil sat in the hospital chapel afterward, his hands shaking as he tried to process what he had heard. This little girl who had become the daughter he had never had, who had taught him more about love and courage than all his business successes combined, was dying, and her father still hadn't come to see her. He found Emma in her room, coloring quietly. She looked up when he entered, and somehow she knew. The doctors told you, didn't they? She said with a calmness that broke his heart. Khalil nodded, not trusting his voice. It's okay, Emma said, reaching for his hand. I'm not scared, but I have a favor to ask. Anything. When I die, will you make sure my dad knows that I forgave him? Will you tell him that I understand why he couldn't visit? Sometimes love hurts too much, and people run away from it. The wisdom in her words, the forgiveness in her 8-year-old heart, shattered something inside Khalil that had been frozen for years. He thought about all the ways he had run from love, all the excuses he had made, all the opportunities he had missed with his own son. That night, Khalil called Amir again, but this time, he didn't just listen, he talked. He told his son about Emma, about the lessons she had taught him, about the regrets that had been eating at him for years. He apologized for the father he had been and promised to be better. Baba, Amir said quietly, I've been waiting for this call my whole life. I'm coming to Dubai, Khalil said. I'm going to spend Christmas with you, if you'll have me. I'd like that, Amir replied, and Khalil could hear the smile in his voice. Emma's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next 2 weeks. Khalil spent every possible moment at her bedside, reading to her, holding her hand, being the father figure she had asked him to be. Other children in the ward began to gravitate toward him, drawn by his gentle presence and the way he treated each of them as if they were his own. The nurses started calling him Papa Khalil, and he found himself coordinating with the hospital to improve conditions for all the children. He funded a new play area, hired additional child life specialists, and established a program to provide emotional support for families dealing with pediatric illness. But his focus remained on Emma, who grew weaker each day but never lost her spirit. On her last day, Emma was barely conscious, but she squeezed Khalil's hand when he whispered that he loved her, that she had changed his life, that he would never forget the gift she had given him. "Tell my dad," she whispered, so quietly he had to lean close to hear. "Tell him I love him." Emma Martinez died on a Tuesday morning in December, with Khalil holding her hand and the winter sun streaming through her hospital window. The nurses found him there an hour later, still holding her small fingers, tears streaming down his face. The funeral was small but profound. Khalil had tracked down Emma's father, a broken man named Carlos who worked double shifts at a warehouse to pay for medical bills he couldn't afford. Carlos had stayed away, not from lack of love, but from an overwhelming grief that had paralyzed him. When Khalil delivered Emma's message of forgiveness, both men wept together in the back pew of a small Catholic church in Seattle's Georgetown neighborhood. But Emma's story didn't end with her death. Khalil established the Emma Martinez Foundation, dedicated to providing emotional and financial support for families dealing with pediatric illness. He hired Carlos as the program director, giving him a chance to honor his daughter's memory by helping other families navigate the impossible journey they had faced alone. The Foundation's first initiative was a program that paired volunteer surrogate parents with children whose families couldn't be present during treatment. Khalil trained the volunteers himself, teaching them the lessons Emma had taught him about presence, patience, and unconditional love. 6 months after Emma's death, Khalil stood in the same hospital where they had met, but this time he wasn't alone. Amir had flown in from Dubai to help launch the Foundation's expansion to other cities. Father and son worked side by side, their relationship rebuilt on the foundation of honesty and vulnerability that Emma had inspired. "She would have liked you," Khalil told his son as they watched volunteers reading to children in the new family room. "I wish I could have met her," Amir replied. "She sounds like she was an amazing little girl." "She was," Khalil said. "Wait, and she taught me that being a father isn't about providing everything. It's about being present for anything." The foundation expanded to hospitals in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Atlanta, each location staffed by people who understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give a child is simply showing up. Khalil split his time between cities, but he never missed his weekly video calls with Amir, and he visited Dubai every other month. On the first anniversary of Emma's death, Khalil returned to room 314, which had been converted into a family meditation space. A small plaque by the window read, "In memory of Emma Martinez, who taught us that love is not measured in time, but in presence." He sat in the same chair where he had spent so many afternoons, remembering the little girl who had asked him to pretend to be her father, and had ended up teaching him how to be a real one. The rain was falling again, just as it had the day they met, but this time it felt like a blessing rather than a burden. What would you have done in that moment when Emma first asked you to pretend to be her dad? Would you have had the courage to say yes, knowing it would change everything about how you understood love and responsibility? Khalil's phone buzzed with a text from Amir. "Thinking about Emma today. Thank you for becoming the father she helped you remember how to be." As he left the hospital that evening, Khalil passed the children's ward where new young patients were beginning their own difficult journeys. Some had families surrounding them, others sat alone. He made a mental note to expand the volunteer program, to ensure that no child would have to face their darkest hours without someone to hold their hand. The Foundation's work continued to grow, touching thousands of families across the country. But for Khalil, it would always come back to one little girl in a hospital bed, coloring pictures of the father she wished would visit, teaching a billionaire that the greatest fortune isn't measured in dollars, but in the moments we choose to show up for each other. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear about the power of presence. Or better yet, find a way to volunteer in your own community, because sometimes the most profound changes begin with simply saying yes when someone asks for your time. Emma's teddy bear now sits in Khalil's office in Dubai, a reminder that love doesn't require blood relations or legal documents. Sometimes it just requires a willingness to sit in an uncomfortable chair and pretend to be someone's dad, until you realize you're not pretending anymore.